In classrooms across the world, teachers are being warned not to remain at the bottom of Bloom's pyramid. Remembering is treated as ordinary, understanding is tolerated, but the lesson is not considered impressive until students begin to analyze, evaluate, and create. So, a teacher writes something like this: by the end of the lesson, learners should be able to evaluate. Then the supervisor will just smile, right? The objective sounds very intelligent, but there's only one small problem. The students cannot explain the subject they have been asked to evaluate. They do not know the essential facts, they misunderstand the vocabulary, they cannot remember what was taught last week. So, but at least the verb is standing proudly at the top of the pyramid. And of course, we're also hanging them on the classroom wall. And it's supposed, right? It's supposed to be a diagram responsible for this compulsory journey, which we call Benjamin Bloom's famous pyramid. Except Benjamin Bloom never created that pyramid. It does not appear in the original 1956 publication. It does not appear in the major 2001 revision either. So, who created the pyramid? And why did a classification tool become a staircase? And how did one colorful triangle begin controlling lesson plans, classroom observations, and teacher training programs across the world? So, to understand these questions, we need to go back to 1948. Now, it's not to Benjamin Bloom sitting alone and suddenly discovering six levels of human thought. The real story is less dramatic, more collaborative, and far more useful. You see, a group of college examiners had gathered informally during the American Psychological Association convention in Boston. They had a practical problem, and the problem is this: universities were setting examinations, they were developing curricula and describing learning outcomes, but educators did not share a consistent language for explaining what their questions were asking students to do. One examiner might call a question understanding, another might describe a similar question as reasoning, and the other lecturer can say, okay, advanced knowledge. Without a common framework, comparing educational objectives across institutions was difficult. So, this group of examiners wanted to build a classification system, that is, a taxonomy that could help examiners communicate more precisely. And the word classification matters here. Let me give you what classification means. A library classifies books, a biology classifies organisms. A taxonomy organizes categories so that people can examine relationships and communicate more clearly. So it does not automatically tell everyone that life must proceed through the categories in one compulsory sequence. Following that 1948 meeting, conferences continued over several years. Benjamin Bloom, an educational psychologist at the University of Chicago, became a central leader in the work. But he was not working alone. The 1956 book carried the title Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, the Classification of Educational Goals, Handbook 1, Cognitive Domain. On its title page were five names: Benjamin Bloom, Max Engelhardt, Edward First, Walker Hill, and David Cratwell. Okay, see? And I'm sure most teachers have never heard of these names. The framework is universally called Bloom's taxonomy, which makes it sound like one brilliant man arranged human thought into six boxes before breakfast. But the publication itself described the work as the product of a committee of college and university examiners. Bloom chaired the group and edited the volume. His influence was substantial, no doubt, but the famous taxonomy emerged from collaboration, discussion, revision, and disagreement. That is the first distortion in this story. Educational history remembered the chairman and misplaced much of the committee. The second distortion is even more visible. Open the original book and search for the famous multicolored pyramid. It is not there. So, no triangle, no staked blocks, no tiny knowledge section condemned to live permanently in the educational basement. Okay, so the original cognitive categories were knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. The committee did describe them as moving from simpler to more complex behaviors, and of course, the original taxonomy had a cumulative hierarchical intention. In some situations, performance in a more complex category depended upon abilities associated with earlier categories. So, we should not replace one myth with another. The framework did contain hierarchy, but a hierarchy is not automatically the rigid staircase many schools later constructed from it. Follow me. The original authors also recognized that educational objectives could involve more than one type of behavior. Real intellectual work does not always enter one category, so complete his assignment and politely wait for the permission to visit the next. Then something strange happened. The book became famous, but the book itself became less familiar. Its detailed explanations were compressed into charts, and the charts were compressed into verbs, and the verbs were placed inside a pyramid. And guess what? The pyramid began teaching the taxonomy more powerfully than the original publication did. The exact first creator of the familiar pyramid is difficult to establish reliably, right? So, what can be verified is that it was not part of the 1956 volume. Education loves a pyramid. Put an idea inside a triangle, give every section a different color, and suddenly the triangle develops constitutional authority. The visual carried an irresistible message. The bottom must be less valuable, the top must be the destination. The learner must climb. And because knowledge appeared at the bottom, remembering facts began to sound intellectually embarrassing. And teachers were encouraged to pursue higher order thinking, which is a worthwhile ambition, right? But in some schools, that ambition turned into a forced choice. Either students remember information or think critically. Yes, thinking requires something to think with. A student cannot meaningfully evaluate two explanations of climate change without understanding the relevant scientific concepts and evidence. A child cannot analyze a poem without lacking the vocabulary needed to understand its sentences. Or let's talk about the history student who cannot judge whether a political decision was justified without knowing what happened, who was involved, and what alternatives existed. Knowledge is not the enemy of thinking. Knowledge is actually the part of its equipment. This does not mean children should spend every lesson memorizing disconnected fact. It means retrieval, understanding, application, analysis, and creation are often interconnected. Their relationship depends on the subject, the learner's existing knowledge, and the task. But by the end of the 20th century, the taxonomy had been used for nearly 50 years. Research on learning had developed, curricula had changed, the educational objectives had become more complex. So the framework needed revision. And guess what? One of the people returned to it was David Cratwell. Remember the same Cratwell whose name appeared on the original 1956 volume. He worked with Lauren Anderson, who had been one of Bloom's students, and a new group of specialists in educational psychology, curriculum, instruction, testing, and assessment. So, in 2001, they published a taxonomy for learning, teaching, and assessing. Now, notice what happened again. Hmm? Not Bloom's. This was another collaborative work. Anderson and Cratwell edited it, but Peter Arasian, Kathleen Cronshak, Richard Mayer, Paul Pintrick, and James Rath Merely Whitroth were also named contributors. Once again, schools inherited a framework associated with a small number of famous names, while an entire intellectual team stood behind it. The revision changed the familiar category nouns into cognitive process verbs. You wanna hear? Knowledge became remember, comprehension became understanding, application became apply, analysis became analyze, evaluation remained evaluate, synthesis renamed to create, and moved above evaluate. You see, this produced the sequence we now see and recognize: remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. But the deeper revision was not simply changing nouns into verbs and moving create to the top. The revised framework became two dimensional. One dimension described cognitive processes, the other described four kinds of knowledge. In case you don't know, let me explain. Let me say them: factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive. I'm going to explain them. Now, factual knowledge includes terminology and essential details. When we talk about conceptual knowledge, it concerns relationships, classifications, principles, models, and theories. Then procedural knowledge involves methods, techniques, algorithms, and knowing how to do something. Then we come to metacognitive knowledge. This involves awareness of thinking, strategies, and one's own cognitive processes. The revision was therefore not merely a newer staircase, it was closer to a table. A teacher could examine the kind of knowledge being taught and the cognitive process students were expected to perform with that knowledge. You see, that table could reveal imbalance. It could help align objectives, learning activities, and assessment. It could also show that a teacher claimed to teach analysis but tested only recall. It could also reveal that students were expected to create without receiving the factual, conceptual, or procedural knowledge the task required. So here is the irony. The pyramid became more famous than the table. Now, okay, the revision deliberately offered educators a richer, two-dimensional planning framework. Popular education squeezed it back into six colored layers. Years later, teachers inherited the simplified version. Consider a secondary school history classroom. The teacher wants to demonstrate a higher order teaching, so the students are immediately asked to evaluate whether a historical leader made the correct decision. It sounds ambitious, right? But the student cannot identify the major events surrounding the decision. They have not examined the available evidence. Some do not understand the political vocabulary inside the question. So, the inherited belief says evaluation is at the top, so begin climbing. The consequence is performance without substance. Students exchange unsupported opinions, and the teacher mistakes conversation for critical thinking. So, a better response begins by building the necessary knowledge, establish the people, chronology, concepts, and competing accounts. Then ask students to analyze the evidence. They should compare interpretations and defend the judgment. You see, The lesson may move backwards and forward between remembering, understanding, analyzing, and evaluating. That is not failure. That is thinking. Now, enter a primary science classroom. Children are learning about materials. The teacher believes create, in the pyramid is the highest level. So every child is told to design a bridge immediately. The cardboard appears, then the glues, then everybody becomes wonderfully busy. Unfortunately, the learners have not investigated strength, shape, balance, or load. They create bridges, but they cannot explain why one structure stands and another collapses. The inherited belief says creation is automatically superior to knowledge. But see, the better response is to let the children examine existing structures. They need to learn essential concepts. They need to test different materials. They need to analyze their failures. They also need to revise their designs and explain their decisions. Creation still matters here, right? But now it is informed creation. This is why the verbs themselves can also become dangerous when used carelessly. A verb does not guarantee a level of thinking. The word explain might require deep understanding, or it might actually invite a memorized sentence. Then create, the verb create in the pyramid might involve sophisticated synthesis, or it might mean coloring a poster copied from the board. Then we look at evaluate. That may demand evidence based judgment, or it may produce nothing more than I like it because it is nice. The cognitive demand comes from the complete task, the knowledge required, the conditions, and the quality of reasoning expected, not from one impressive verb in a lesson note. Bloom taxonomy is still useful, no doubt. It can help teachers vary questions, examine assessment, and notice when teaching remains trapped in a narrow range of cognitive activity. It can also help school leaders check whether objectives, instruction, and assessment are aligned. But it should not be treated as a commandment that every lesson must begin with remembering and finished with creating. Not every activity must touch all the six categories. Who told you that they must? Not every learner enters with the same prior knowledge. Yeah. And not every act of creation is more demanding than every act of analysis. And remembering is not intellectually worthless simply because a graphic designer placed it downstairs. Schools should stop inspecting lesson plans by counting ambitious verbs. They should start investigating what knowledge students need, what mental work the task actually demands, and what evidence will demonstrate genuine lesson. Teachers should retain the taxonomy as a questioning and planning tool. And teachers should also correct the belief that its categories are isolated rooms. Teachers should also use the revised taxonomy table to examine both knowledge and cognitive process. And they should also allow learning to move, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, sometimes across several processes at once. Perhaps that is the part of the story we should not ignore. The taxonomy did not remain inside a committee meeting or 1956 handbook. It traveled. It entered teacher training programs, curriculum documents, school inspections, and classrooms across the world. But as it traveled, a collaborative classification system became one man's pyramid. The framework was colorful. You can see it, right? It was memorable. It was everywhere. But Benjamin Bloom, never drew it. So the question is no longer simply what Benjamin Bloom taught education. The deeper question here is what have we been doing in his name, Benjamin Bloom? So this story was never about Bloom's taxonomy. It is a warning about What happens when education repeats a diagram more often than it reads the work behind it? So, to you listening to me, what other educational belief have we accepted simply because the generation before us placed it inside the teacher training manual? I need you to share your thoughts in the comment and follow this channel, Who Taught Education This? Because some of the ideas controlling today's classrooms have histories we were never taught. Don't forget to like, don't forget to comment, don't forget to share. Until I come your way, same channel next time.